Hi there. My name is Aina Adashinsky, and I am the program manager at Small Housing. I'm also a graduate student who is developing a growing interest or obsession about the connection between housing and parking. So, why the parking brake? We agree that upzoning single detached neighborhoods can help unlock more housing supply, and we're also acutely aware that there needs to be infrastructure to support the additional density. In August, we shared our servicing and infrastructure roundtables recommendations. And for this session, we gathered a group of transformative thinkers and doers to help explore another question that frequently arises in discussions about gentle density housing. Dude, where's my car? In the last few years in Canada, parking reforms have started to materialize. For example, some municipalities are taking steps to make parts of their cities less car centric, and some developers are introducing car free and car light housing. During this session, we imagine a decoupling of housing and parking, a parking brake. We'll learn about parking reform from the perspectives of community planners, developers, and transportation reform champions. We'll share with colleagues about parking reform challenges in our communities, and we'll explore ideas about how parking reforms and gentle density might work together to contribute to housing abundance. This session was different than previous webinars. At registration, we offered sessions on 4 topics, and attendees selected 2 choices. They attended 2 30-minute breakout sessions consisting of a presentation with time for discussion and questions afterward. Since people couldn't be everywhere all at once, we recorded the presentations for everyone so they could catch up on the sessions they missed. Those recordings are what you're viewing today. Our first session is parking reform initiatives in small and car-dependent communities. Due to extremely popular demand, we added a second breakout room for the topic, and both Nancy Henderson and Natasha Elliott joined us from Urban Systems to present. The session you're watching today is from Nancy Henderson. Nancy is a local senior government advisor at Urban Systems in Kelowna. She has 31 years of local government experience, including 9 years as a consultant and 22 years in municipal government. Since joining Urban Systems, a considerable portion of Nancy's consultancy focuses on development approval process improvements and development finance, and she has spent a great deal of time recently with local governments to amend their parking mandates.
Right. Hi, guys. Well, I had like the nice introduction there, so I won't go on too much with that. But yeah, Nancy Henderson with Urban Systems, working with a variety of municipalities across the province, from basically the southern half from Tofino all the way to Invermere and Radium. And I see Adams here and from Kelowna doing quite a bit of infill work, particularly for Kelowna and other municipalities, and a lot of like housing work of late and housing accelerator fund applications that all included parking reduction actions. So without further ado, just kind of take you, I think everyone has a pretty good understanding of this history of parking and the requirements that we have. Old zoning bylaws, we see that quite a bit where they're 20 years old, sometimes greater, with sort of the 2-car family or 3-car family parking requirements, often in multifamily, ranging from sort of 1 to 2 stalls per unit. We've seen in our smaller communities sometimes like more parking than building on a lot. And something that as we're looking towards infill, there's pressure to reduce parking spaces. But in smaller communities, we do tend to have a lot of parking in our neighborhoods. There's sometimes, lack of infrastructure and, sprawling development. Sometimes that's also a result of, in our real small communities, not even having a lot of infrastructure services in large lots, based on maybe septic systems, really spreading out the communities and therefore making like the vehicle sort of a natural choice for most trips. One thing that we talk a lot about, and my colleague Natasha is kind of taking on another group, is we have our minimum parking requirements in our zoning bylaws. I think planners are often taking, oh, what are they doing in another town, and taking those requirements and transferring them to their municipality, sort of from a comparative analysis perspective. but not always calling those municipalities to seeing like what's working. So whether, especially as we're getting into this sort of parking diet and reducing regulations, I really recommend, like we're talking about Burnaby, and once they've had a chance to kind of see how that works, and the implications from those, doing those calls and making sure that we fully understand the decisions that we make versus just sort of blindly copying regulations. Now we've got significant costs related to our current parking policies, and certainly in a lot of the multifamily developments beyond Missing Middle, or at the higher end apartment size of Missing Middle, certainly a lot of developers pushing for reduced parking requirements as well, and those market demands because of the cost of structured parking, especially. But we're starting to see those as well in sort of the Plex type development for a whole bunch of other reasons. And what I'm finding in a lot of the work outside of like the Metro Vancouver area is the market is still demanding parking. So those are some of the things that we wanted to talk about. But yeah, if we can fit more on a lot, the parking comes with a land cost. And so we're starting to see those parking spaces shift to the street. And so why consider parking reductions? So, it is transportation is the second biggest cost to households. So so many people aren't able to afford housing right now. So what else can we cut? So if we can get people out of their cars, or at least sharing cars, it's helping households afford homes. Not having parking or making it expensive for people, or at least even a cognitive decision by decoupling parking from their real estate entity, that you're paying for it. I think it's making people realize, well, if I have to pay, 30 grand for a parking stall, what other choices do I have? When you see the true cost of driving. So we're also, as you all know, I mean, just the whole unaffordability of the single family lot is just driving this higher density demands and realities we're facing. And yeah, so market viability, we've been looking at increasing the number of units on infill housing from, say 4 to 6. And once you start doing that on the sort of standard traditional single family lot, it's really hard to fit everything on that we need to. So sometimes it's just also the inability of land is creating the need to reduce parking requirements. And then how does that fit with reality? Even I've found in the smaller communities, in really pro parking diet groups, parking is still a major conversation and something that we're questioning the reductions on. We've got still concerns about the single family character of neighborhoods and how to maintain that with Plex development. How to create a level playing field as well, because we've made it really easy for single family homes and monster homes, if you will, to go in with very little requirements. So why can't we make it easy for infill as well? But all the trade-offs that we're seeing, and especially like related to reduced parking, the need to go up, to fit some parking on the site, and then how that affects neighborhood character. I think the heat island and stormwater management is really driving the preservation of trees as well. And there's many municipalities that have people specifically working on urban forestry. So it's really important to include a variety of people in the conversations, because some of these goals that we have are at cross purposes. Fitting site coverage and if you're concerned about height, is fitting the whole development in, the parking and all the needs is proving to be pretty challenging. There's a lot of perception in and around the street as well, which is a real reality, I think, especially when you get to the council table. Just one second, I gotta plug in here. Is that at the council table, this whole like the street is mine and it's not public, and I don't want cars all over my street, and neighborhoods aren't as nice when they do that, and sort of dealing with that perception is really important. Yeah, so, and that's just that street interface and creating parking when you don't have a lane is proving to be quite problematic as well. Okay, so there you go. So Vancouver, and they're right now, there's a council report. I think it went this week, but I had one from, I think it was August, where they're bringing forward the infill bylaws with zero parking requirements. And I cut and paste this right from the council report. And I know the focus of this is on small towns and more car dependent communities, but I think there's something here that's really an important consideration. And I think something that we're all having these conversations with our colleagues is that multiplex development in infill housing is going to occur incrementally. And so we don't expect significant immediate impacts to street parking by not having these requirements. So I think the other thing is the first sentence is we still expect most households will own one vehicle. They're just going to park them on the street. We can handle them now, but in the future we might have a problem. And so like the need to sort of plan for the future, but because of the housing crisis, it's a trade-off that we're willing to accept. Small town answer, we're not Vancouver. We don't have car share or a very functional car share. We don't necessarily have a great taxi network. Sometimes smaller communities have one or two taxis. No Uber, very little transit, not frequent. And sometimes it's really easy to get around with bike and pedestrian corridors, but it's not as an extensive network. And much of the smaller communities in BC are in snow country or in the winter weather, where in the summer it works great, but what about the rest of the year? In small communities, we tend to have more trucks and SUVs than in the city. Lots of toys and equipment and things we want to use on the weekends, and we need places to store them. And then sometimes like maybe you can meet your daily need if you live close to the downtown area, but you need your car to go get those big shops, or there's a lot of goods that you can't necessarily acquire in the community you live. And many people are living in small town communities because they want outdoor adventures and they want to be able to hit the road on the weekends or whatever. So just like some of the parking realities is that we're hearing, and even in some of the bigger cities, is I can't fit my truck in the garage, and then or my garage is just filled with stuff. And I think that's the most people aren't even parking in the parking that's provided. So and hey, I've got all this stuff, I don't want to go away on weekends, or maybe I come into town as a seasonal worker in some of the resort communities and no car works for 4 months, but hey, I want to go and do adventures. I buy a car, and like that's sort of some of the realities with that. I think sometimes the seasonality of riding in British Columbia is another like sort of factor. Great in the summer, not so great in the winter. Then we've got like our 15-minute cities conspiracy theorists. This is a billboard just in Westbank First Nation lands on your way into Kelowna. Sort of already with the counter argument to reduce parking, if you will. Also, just as we mentioned, just the transit, and it can be kind of a lonely place and often very infrequent into many of the smaller communities and neighborhoods. So I don't mean to be coming off negative, but I mean, these are some of the realities that we're facing. But hey, we're also in need for missing middle housing. Some of the things too that we think about as we're trying to fit the missing middle on the lot is all the things that we need to fit on the lot. And this is one, I think, key driver to really look at parking. Because fitting, 2 stalls or even 1 stall per unit on a lot, there's not really enough room in a lot of the cases. Like, where's the garbage and recycling going to go? How is that getting picked up? Some of the larger centers might have MULOC or like some of these large bins, but I mean, the smaller communities in BC, like maybe that infrastructure is not in place. So Hydro kiosks has proved to be a real issue fitting these in on the property. And stormwater management, it's often getting placed under a driveway. And like the reality is in 20 years, we need these things to be maintained, where bioswales don't work in snow country, and how to fit this all in on the lot. And I think this incremental idea of parking management is, the reality is we still, like, if we're going to park on the street, we might need to manage that in the future and to be ready for that. As well as the preservation of trees is just coming up to be a huge item. And when you put all of this along with the density, there's not much land left. And it gets a lot harder when you don't have lane access. When you have lane access and there's maybe parking at the rear, it can work a lot better. But when you don't, just creating parking aisles and circulation takes up a large part of the site. So another reason to put parking on a bit of a diet, but realizing that means street parking, probably in a small town concept or the context. And I think the other thing is looking at like who's buying these properties. And I was in a developer workshop last week, and they said, they're generally a couple with a dog. And maybe they are one-car families, but if they have kids and those kids become teenagers and they're unable to move into a larger unit or a place with more parking, we end up with more parking on the street. Here's an example. This is the Plex housing, and this is in City of Kelowna on the left. It's gone really well. There's been a lot of uptake. These are based on sort of 4 units. You could see the parking. There is a garage, generally filled with stuff. This is the street. It's not meant for parking. It's certainly not meant for perpendicular parking, but it's always filled with parking. And so the people are coming with cars, they're parking on the street. This is sort of meant to be a bit of a leave strip for now to deal with stormwater management. But if there's as you can see, there's no pedestrian infrastructure here. So if the city wants to put in pedestrian or NATC in this area, they're going to be taking away this parking that people are already assuming, not necessarily rightfully, but it's theirs. So it might be easier to build that infrastructure first if you can, because this ATC is also an important component. This was another thing that has come up in conversation is that people want parking, they want more parking, and looking at like car elevators. I think they come at about 10,000 a piece. So these are things that people are looking at, or even putting the car during the summer while they're biking up above, and they could use the garage for storage. So this is coming from the development community. So I think when looking at like consideration of reductions, it's incremental. We have to do it. We're moving that way, but we need to also look at the impacts that are coming in the future and make sure that those realities are discussed with council and other departments, so that we have budgets for ATCs, that we look at increasing transit, or that we really look at developing car share programs that work, and dealing with on-street parking management. It's a big task. It comes with quite a bit of an expense, and it's something that I don't think small towns really anticipate, but looking at that, and just sort of planning for when that incremental change hits the wall, and what's that going to look like, and how are you going to deal with it. And let's hope for the autonomous vehicle by that stage that's just kind of hovering around and is being shared. And maybe that is a reality that we can all hope for. And like right now, the market demand that we're seeing in the smaller communities and car dependent communities is they want parking. But let's hope that maybe we have autonomous vehicles before that gets to be a real problem. So some of the option considerations, and I know I'm taking like way too much time here, but the option considerations that we're seeing is like the no minimum, which we're not really seeing in the small town area yet. We're starting to see some reductions of, maybe 0.6. But probably that 1 stall per unit is probably a reality that is probably where the comfort level of most communities are that we're seeing. But definitely some of the larger centers with transit and ATC are reducing that. And then reduction sort of based on location is another one politically that's often used, is like when you can meet your daily demands or when it's close to transit, will reduce parking to less than one. And then in terms of decoupling parking, especially if you have less than one stall per unit, and how you can essentially sell a unit without the parking, or sell the unit, the parking space at a cost. Interestingly, I had some developers basically say they were the first units to sell in some cases, but when you're going to higher end luxury units, is the more parking provided, the more popular the unit. So a lot of it's really at the affordable end of the market. There's more, I think, desire to see parking decoupled. So just like some examples of the geographic parking reductions, often, based on walkability to frequent transit or meeting the daily needs. So core infill and core urban areas, reduce parking; suburban infill, more parking. Some of the recommendations that we'd suggest is just really understanding the incrementality of it. And you've got neighborhoods that are like old buildings, high probability of development. It might not actually be that incremental. It might be incremental over 5 or 10 years, but you might see a lot in those areas. So I would consider your sort of capital budget expenditures based on it. But I found when we kind of look at the incrementality of it, it also changes the conversation when talking to other departments, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're not talking about here, such as fire flows and water demand and sewage capacity. But when you can kind of see where info is going to happen, it really changes the discussion. And then just be aware of all the other trade-offs that maybe are outside of your department. Getting an idea what you want to do, and talking to developers, and then start planning, for the impacts. So I think that's kind of enough of me. Love to hand it over to you guys, and just we've kind of got some similar questions that were asked up front, but what's going on in your municipalities in terms of parking reductions for gentle density, whether that be ADUs or plexes. Is it less than one stall per unit, or do you have any, geographical based parking requirements? So yeah, what's going on in your communities, and where are you guys from?
Our next presentation is Bringing Active Transportation and Car Shares to Your Community. Burnaby City Councillor Allison Gu is a Chinese settler born to first-generation immigrants living on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. Her priorities at the municipal level include active transportation, decarbonizing buildings, affordable housing, and equity. Prior to her time in office, Allison cycled from Ottawa to Burnaby against the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline while fundraising for the legal fees of the First Nations fighting the project in court.
Hi, everybody. I am Allison. I'm a Burnaby City Councillor, and this is my council. One question that I have for you to think about is, what are your biggest challenges when it comes to working with members of council? And feel free to ask and pose them at the end, and I'll see if I can give you any advice. Biggest from a general standpoint, what I see as being a big disconnect between planners and councils is some of the language that is used for the sake of clarity within your field, but causes a lack of clarity for lay people such as mayor and council. And there will always be a majority of lay people or people who are not planners on your council, and being able to bridge that communication gap is really, really crucial in order to get what you want to get accomplished done. And your other audience that you need to convince are also lay people, which is the public. And more importantly, they're concerned primarily with how their day-to-day lives are going to be impacted. And so keeping it simple, really trying to put yourself in the shoes of lay people and council is really crucial. This is an example, and this is not, I don't know which staff member wrote this, and I don't really care, and this is not to put anybody on blast, but this is an example as a layperson, as a counselor, where I felt like we missed the mark on the communications and the framing of moving our new city hall to a different neighborhood. So I'll just go through real quick. It's the preferred area because it's developing into Burnaby's true downtown core. Most people don't have connection to that, why that is important, why it matters for the city hall to be in the true downtown core, and how that relates to them. As established in the 2017 Metrotown Downtown Plan, a lot of people haven't even heard of that plan, let alone read it. And so they don't understand the significance of plans. They don't understand what a civic heart means, and what that has to do with why City Hall should move there. Most people don't know that Metro Vancouver is a whole separate level of government, and so they don't understand why Metro Vancouver's regional growth strategy is important, or why it being designated as a regional city center is relevant. And therefore, there's a lot of jargon in here that they don't relate with, that are arbitrary kind of blueprints that they don't see impacting their day-to-day lives. We know that people are concerned about climate change. We know that people are concerned about traffic. We know that people are concerned about housing. And all of those pieces would have been included in the new city hall if it had been moved to Metrotown. And we could have been posing it as we want to support staff, the thousands of staff that are driving to work every single day right now, to be able to take public transit because it's connected to a bus bay and a SkyTrain line. We want to be able to support housing affordability in our community, and house employees and house our residents at more affordable rates. And so we want to build housing on top of City Hall, and we want to make sure that we're supporting climate-friendly, communities, 15-minute communities, et cetera. And I think that would have been a communications lens that might have connected more with the average person, to allow them to see why City Hall moving to Metrotown would have been a good thing. Primarily, you have to try to put yourself in council's shoes as much as possible. So beyond the fact that they're lay people, we are lay people. Much of my colleagues are often primarily focused on taxes. And taxes, they come from operating impacts, as you know, and traffic increasing parking leads to more traffic and cars, which leads to more requirements for road infrastructure and maintenance, and that has to come from operating always, because of, at least if you're in BC. All residents hate traffic, including council. Most of council members are drivers. And so making the argument that if we create a supply or demand for the parking availability, it means that we create a supply of traffic. Some councils, such as mine, like density, because density fundamentally allows the taxes to stay lower. And that means that they can continue to be elected. Unfortunately, we are going to be continuously associating density with negative impacts from a resident point of view, because of all that residents see when density comes is increased traffic, and an impact on their daily lives. So making the argument to councils that there's likely going to be a further lack of political appetite from the public point of view to support density if we don't get our traffic and our parking situation under control. Framing things as solution-oriented, not just regulatory, even though we know that we need both, is a very, typical politician line, is that we need carrots, not sticks. We know that we need both, and pairing them together is the most effective way to take the air out of that argument. Unfortunately, councils tend to be responsive to loud and consistent voices, and that's where the public is really, really important. You know that you can't always rely on your councils to make the right decisions on their own, and that's why doing really good engagement is key. Thinking about how to maximize the voices that are going to support the evidence-based decision-making that you are going to put forward. Who does that align with, and allowing engagement to be more accessible for those people? Because typically what we see from engagement is that it's the people who have the most time on their hands, retirees, homeowners, people who are simply, or who are going to be negatively impacted and who are more likely to write into council to make a big deal about it. We know that the silent majority is a consistent pattern alongside any change that governments tend to make, and making sure that councils have access to those voices through your engagement is really, really important. For example, laneway homes, 75% of residents supported laneway homes, and that made it really, it passed unanimously there, despite a few concentrated voices around negative aspects to height, negative aspects to views, and negative impacts on residential parking. So making it accessible means going to those urban areas where young people are going to be, dense areas, alongside bike routes, or partnering with car share companies to engage their users, because it ultimately supports them, whatever you're doing around active transportation and decreasing car ownership. And then at the same time, if those don't apply to your community, just trying to be creative around getting the voices who you want to hear from to actually participate. That being said, surveys are limited because councils find it easier, in my experience, to ignore a number than to ignore a name. It's easier to ignore, 47% of people supported this, versus hundreds of, tens or hundreds of people writing in very charged, very angry, and wanting to meet with you, wanting to have a phone call with you, pestering councils to try to make their argument. So that is a challenge, and it's something that at the end of the day you can mitigate with some of your timing and being strategic about your timing. Most council members are concerned with getting reelected, unfortunately, and that makes our lack of engagement in the municipal election process is a significant barrier to getting a good representation of voices who are on councils. And so the best mitigation effort that I would suggest with that is to time your big projects. If you've got existing council members, perhaps a slim majority who has been historically supportive of active transportation, of car share, of climate-oriented planning, then having those projects time it so it can get passed within your existing council. If you know that your council is not as friendly, taking advantage of the first 2 years of an election cycle is really, really important, so that by the time the changes actually get implemented, there's time for residents to see the positive benefits of active transportation. Car share. So if you were part of the plenary session where we're talking about car share is a hugely important aspect to decreasing private car ownership. And from a council and layperson perspective, perhaps you've got more conservative folks, perhaps you've got people who really are car-centric minded. Car share is the closest alternative to private car ownership. It's easier for somebody as a layperson to envision as an alternative to owning a car, and the economic argument often makes sense. And pitching that economic argument from a resident point of view and including it can be really helpful, because most people, including council, are not thinking about the economics of how much car ownership really costs, between parking, between the actual car itself, insurance, gas, maintenance and repairs. It can be very, very costly, and it's very convenient to go to just have a car waiting for you in your building, in the residential building that you live in, and to be able to access that whenever you want. It is, like I said, in the carrot and stick framing, it's a clear carrot alternative where public transit and cycling are not considered feasible, whether due to infrastructure or weather. So the barriers to car share. One of the biggest barriers is that car share operators will want to have parking in your municipality, and to be able to allow road space to those car share operators is an important, it's a key crucial aspect to them being able to successfully operate. Legally, you're, as a municipality, you're going to want to work with your legal department to establish a car share operating agreement, or to consult a lawyer to make sure that no liabilities exist from a municipality's point of view, and then their business case. So their business case often looks like the density per acre. It could look like the demographics of your municipality versus their user groups, and then the average distance that you might travel within a municipality. So some ways to work through this is to have smaller operating zones to begin with, perhaps as a pilot project. Councils typically like pilot projects because it's lower commitment, and you can wrap the costs of a pilot project not in tax burden. And if you've got reserves or other accounts to draw from, then pilot projects are limited in their financial impact. Increasing density in specific spaces, tying parking minimum eliminations to car share agreements with developers. And contrary to what that previous developer was saying, I'm of the opinion that developers should pay for car share, not necessarily the strata councils, not because the money doesn't come from the same pockets. We know that developers are going to pass down the cost to the residents who move into those buildings, but from a political aspect, it's going to be much easier for a council to support a developer paying for something rather than strata councils. So pitching that as a way, and to ensure that, some strata councils over time, they say, well, we want to cut all the costs. If you've only got a 10-year or 15-year operating agreement in place, then that's a big challenge to infrastructure staying there. It's potentially a case where a car share company like Car2Go can just move out completely, close up, and there's no legal recourse for that. So it's also about the protections for the residents as well as a political aspect to get it passed. And then I had a friend who is on a board of a co-op or a car share company who thought maybe we can try e-cargo bike shares because that supports car share. It supports decreasing private car ownership, and it supports many of the needs that residents use for cars. So kids, bikes, or kids, pets, and cargo. So barriers to obviously saying that you can allow municipal road space to car share operators is easier said than actually doing it. And you are in a context where you're allowing, a car share company like Evo, where they have floating car share, where you can do one-way trips and park anywhere that you want and end the trip. There is going to be the concern with residents, often residents living in single-family neighborhoods, who are upset with the loss of car spaces in front of their buildings. And that's where, coming back from a communications and a framing point of view, where those residents are able to access those cars themselves, that it will support lower parking requirements generally across the city if we're able to support Evo or other floating car share companies, and then working on a one-to-one basis too, privately with councils, building relationships, and making sure that there's a couple of councilors who can, report back to you and organize a majority vote. That's really important because you don't want a vote to, at the end of the day, fail. But at the same time, if it's going to be close, you don't want that to be a barrier to at least having a discussion in the public sphere. One potential way to mitigate some of that loss is to start with round trip only as pilot programs and show your success of the number rides taken, the distance traveled, the number of users through that pilot program, as along with other benefits that I talked about with pilot programs before. The limitation with that, obviously, with the round trip is that you can't really take it somewhere and drop it off. So for certain residents, it doesn't impact their usage, and they would just say, well, I don't want to do a round trip. I would just rather take my car at my 2001 Honda Civic if I was going to do that. So there are pros and cons, and ideally you have space for both types. Barriers with companies not wanting to expand to their business case. Often it's the density per acre that they're looking for. If you show them the numbers and you're advocating for municipalities saying, our demographics are changing, this is what it looks like. I know that this matches with your user group base. Our densities are increasing to this amount, taking advantage of specific nodes or hubs, commercial multiplex hubs, where there's a variety of uses and a variety of reasons that people arrive to those communities or those neighborhoods to try to advocate. Doing negotiations with new development. So those new developments required to pay for car share spots and car share memberships and ongoing costs of for a certain amount of time. And then adding in requirements for a certain ratio and working with car share operators to make sure that that ratio would support their business case, at the same time allowing residents to still enjoy the benefits. So a car share company will likely say, it's probably better for a ratio of 1 to 100 units for developments, but various municipalities in the Lower Mainland have looked closer to 1 to 25 as a ratio, and working with them to find a spot that you're both happy with. And then encouraging council members and residents to advocate. And I don't know if it was me, and I don't want to say that it was me, but I was surprised at how responsive car share companies were to me as an individual councillor, just going and saying, I think you should move to Burnaby. Our changing demographics allow for this neighborhood to be supportive of your membership, and the specific neighborhood, because I knew they weren't going to come to the entire city. The specific neighborhood that I had pointed to, they are now, rumor has it, planning to move in, and so working. From a multi-pronged perspective, it won't ever necessarily be one person who makes those change, but often a concerted effort across multiple audiences. And then also making sure that they hear from their user group that their membership actually wants their car share companies to move to specific areas. With active transportation, unfortunately, cycling and active transportation have become more political, I feel like, over the last few years. At least that's my perspective as a perhaps recent councillor. But I think making the argument around deaths and serious injuries is a really important point of view. To say it's how many deaths is enough or too many, and for me that number is 0. But to frame it too in that it supports reducing serious conflicts between vehicular traffic and cyclists and pedestrians, and that further decreases the cost of car insurance for individuals. It provides safety to drivers to be able to have reduced the impacts of collision and reduce the likelihood of impacts. We know that active transportation, if you build it, they will come. Ideally, you have some sort of numbers, but at the end of the day, you can never really know. You just have to do it. But looking to historical, nearby neighborhoods in your municipality, nearby streets, where when you built that infrastructure and having pictures of that infrastructure being well used, and because oftentimes council are car drivers, and so they may not know that it's well used. They may just think that it's money that's gone to waste, and to quantify how much savings that has resulted in the city. And you'll always have to underestimate the savings because you'll never be able to know what accidents were prevented and what lawsuits were prevented and et cetera, and all that. But being able to put some sort of number to it is also really helpful for council. If you can't make those arguments or you've tried to and they've been unsuccessful, that's where the timing aspect comes into play. Engagement can be really helpful in the sense, not so much of a pro, but removing an anti-argument. Community groups and neighborhood groups, often in single-family homes, can be quite organized. And when they organize, it means that the chances of success for a bike lane or active transportation infrastructure that they are opposed to is going to be politically very difficult to pass. And so making sure that engaging those groups early, making sure that their concerns around legitimate feedback is incorporated, and then at the end of the day, some of it is not in your control. And good design, and that's where planners are really, that's your bread and butter, because when you have here at the council level, when it's coming to the vote, it's already too late to change things and all that. When you have legitimate concerns from drivers, for example, around dooring in quiet residential neighborhoods that are designated as AAA bike infrastructure, for example, where that neighborhood has changed drastically in the last 10 to 20 years, and there's a lot more cycling traffic, but as well a lot more vehicular traffic, that can be a concern. And to have a design or infrastructure modification to prevent those concerns from coming up gives the legitimacy for council to say, okay, yeah, I actually think that this is a safer decision. This is a good decision to move forward with. And if not a pro, then it neutralizes the anti-voice, the anti-argument. And then as well, especially around changing technology around e-scooters and micromobility, the speeds of some of these illegal ones, and user conflicts between pedestrians and cyclists, having good design around separation or where it's not needed, to make sure that you don't have cyclist groups who are coming out and saying, I don't support this infrastructure because it's not separated, and to try to just think about the framework of how do we reduce the polarization of this from a negative standpoint, and at least support the neutral or the positive, so that you can point to the numbers. And going back to the numbers aspect, I know I said that numbers can be not as effective, and if you've got names, but to reduce the chance of the polarization, the anger, the emotions, means that there's going to be fewer angry names. And so you can actually lean on those numbers a little bit more, and they become strengthened through a decreased polarization of that. And that's it. So I'm open to questions. Feel free to answer the question that I had posed in the beginning, or to ask a different question.
Julian West hosted car-free housing and low-carbon communities. Julian is the owner of Urban Thrive, a Victoria-based social enterprise development company that specializes in car-free housing. Julian started Urban Thrive to be a catalyst for creating vibrant, sustainable, and livable communities. His projects blend community-centric design, a commitment to housing attainability, and environmental stewardship to create enriching human-centric homes. Julian walks his talk. He's an avid cyclist, outspoken advocate of sustainable community design, and lives happily car-free with his wife and 3 children.
So as you would have heard in the intro, I'm Julian West. I'm the owner of Urban Thrive. We are a social enterprise housing development company that specializes in car-free missing middle housing. So very sort of on topic for today's session. Our mandate is to be a catalyst for sustainable community development. And that means densifying sort of low density neighborhoods into vibrant, thriving, sort of low carbon communities. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of what we do and sort of how we do it, and just sort of pull out a couple of sort of key examples of how that translates into the type of housing you expect to see from this. And then just open up the conversation and questions. I'm an open book, so really my job here is just to be a resource for you. So I'll do this little presentation and we'll jump into the conversation. And first off, I often like to frame this conversation around the trade-offs that need to be made in any development project. And there's always a tension between what's going to be put on a specific piece of property. And it's often sort of a tension between housing, parking, and green space. And the catch to this is you can't really have all three. One of them is going to suffer at the expense of the other two. And the way that most of our sort of residential communities developed was as single detached neighborhoods where we had a small amount of housing, but lots of green space and lots of parking. So that's how a lot of neighborhoods were established. And as we shift towards conventional multifamily development, we are moving towards emphasizing housing and parking at the expense of green space. And what car-free housing is, we're saying, hey, in this triad, we're actually going to shelve the parking and we're going to focus on providing housing for people in great green spaces. And to me, this is a no-brainer. This makes sense for people who live in these homes. This makes sense for communities. This makes sense for big global problems like climate change. But we're very much in a transitional period where this is relatively new to a lot of folks. So I'm going to walk through how this, how we do this, and what's the benefits of going this way. So first off, how it works, like as a car-free housing developer, like how do I actually make this happen? And really it's about assembling all the ingredients to enable a successful car-free lifestyle so that everyone can live sort of seamlessly without owning a personal vehicle. And the first piece is location. It's absolutely critical. So it's access to AAA cycling network. It's being within an established car share network. It's walkability and having amenities close to home. We like residential streets that are quiet, away from traffic. And good access to transit is nice to have. It's not necessary, but it's a nice bonus. And then on top of that, we augment it by providing robust, sustainable transportation alternatives. So our bike garages are best in class. So every family can have cargo bikes and e-bikes and standard bikes, kids bikes, all the bells and whistles to make that your primary mode of transportation. We recently had a project approved in the city of Victoria for 6 homes. And the size of our bike garage is what they would require for a 26 unit condo building, to kind of give you a perspective on the capacity that you need if this is going to be your primary mode of transportation and you've got big cargo bikes and that kind of stuff. And then just a better design. So parking is a major design constraint. So when you got to accommodate a drive aisle and be able to navigate large vehicles into parking spaces, it fundamentally changes how you design homes. And without that constraint, you can frankly just provide better housing. And I'll go into a bit more of that in a moment. So why do we do this? So for residents, there's a lot of benefits. So we can fit more homes in the same size property without parking. So that means higher density, which allows us to spread out our costs, which allows us to provide homes that are lower priced. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's how the actual economics of it work. Total greater affordability, so not just price, but lower transportation costs. And these are also sort of brand new homes. They're high energy performance. They're under warranty, that kind of stuff. So your month-to-month operating costs are quite low. So compared to an old single detached home in a residential neighborhood, we can provide brand new homes that are lower price, lower transportation costs, and lower maintenance costs. We enable families to be able to live in neighborhoods they were previously excluded from. So a lot of young families get pushed further and further away from sort of our core urban areas into suburban communities, just based on price points. And then they have really high transportation costs. They're spending tons of their time in commuting and so forth. We provide an alternative for them to live closer to where they live, work, and play, which translates into a better lifestyle. Less time in a car seat, sitting in commutes and traffic, more time, with your family, more time being in your community, having really good access to great public amenities and so forth. It allows us to dedicate more space to green space. That's good for our health and well-being and a whole bunch of other things, and allows us to, from a design perspective, emphasize fostering community, which I'll touch more on in a moment as well. From a public perspective, there's tons of benefits as well. So just on emissions, by far the largest source of emissions in Greater Victoria is personal vehicles at 40% of emissions, more than double anything else. It is really the elephant in the room when we're talking about emissions and climate change. We also take fossil fuels completely out of our projects in terms of heating systems, and those are the two largest sources of emissions in our region. Creates safer, more livable streets. So we're talking about traffic and congestion. We're talking about road safety, noise, air, light pollution. Taking people out of vehicles creates safer, more livable streets. It allows us to maintain and expand our urban forests. It allows us to, like I said, provide more housing on the same size lot, which increases our property taxes. And on our project, it's around a 500 to 700% increase in property taxes compared to the existing single family home. What that means is we can invest more in our public realm and create stronger, richer public amenities. And as we add more people into traditionally single detached neighborhoods, that means more shoppers for the local business. So we're strengthening sort of our urban villages. That means more riders for transit, which means we can improve our transit service and invest more in it. That encourages more people to take transit. And there's this virtuous cycle as we densify these neighborhoods. Two quick examples before we shift over to just an open conversation on cost. So we recently had a project approved in Victoria, like I mentioned. It was a sixplex, and we paid about $750,000 for the land. And what that means is that's about $125,000 in land cost per home. And as you reduce the number of homes that's put on a lot, the land cost per home increases, with obviously the least affordable, most expensive option being a single detached house, where that's one household is bearing the entire land cost. If we had to provide parking on this project, we would at most be able to provide 4 homes with parking. And even then, it's probably more like 3. It depends on how much blasting and stuff that you do. But let's say 4 to be generous. What that means is that's more than $60,000 in additional costs just on land to provide the 4 homes with parking. And that's not including municipal fees, architectural fees, service improvements, other types of professional fees like arborist and engineering and so forth. It's basic math, but it fundamentally changes the equation around what it costs to provide housing on a single lot. So we're talking the same amount of space, we're just be able to use it more efficiently. Conversely, there's a trade-off that's made as you add more housing to a property as well. And if you, sort of on a typical sort of urban lot, once you hit a tipping point where you either have to have smaller homes and fewer or no family homes, you have to have a taller building, or the building footprint just gets bigger. So for us, a sixplex on a typical residential lot is kind of the sweet spot in terms of affordability and high livability. And then your community benefits just increase the more housing you provide on the same size space. One final example, here's a side-by-side comparison. This one on the right is that sixplex proposal that we had approved in Victoria. And here is conventional houseplex with parking. And if you have to provide parking, you've got a drive aisle down one side and you've paved the whole rear area, which looks very different from this. And as an alternative, we're able to provide this amazing outdoor space with 9 trees and more than 265 plants in our landscape plan. We have a children's play area, built-in barbecue, picnic seating area. We've got a deck area built in around the tree base here. All of our family homes have direct access to this community gardens in the back. We've got tons of windows overlooking this space and creating this really great connectivity between the interior exterior spaces. This is a fundamentally different use of space. This fundamentally changes your lifestyle and how you relate to the place that you live and the community that you live. And this is the kind of trade-offs that we make when we talk about sort of parking reform. And for us, this is a clear no-brainer. This creates sort of a higher quality, better place to live. And for people who choose to live without a car, this is just more value. And there's more and more people who want to live this way. So this is what we do, and this is what we focus on. And part of our mandate is to show these are the type of trade-offs that can be made, and giving people the choice to make that select that option.
Colton Kersop shared about open option parking in Edmonton, Alberta. Colton is the business lead community planning at McElhaney. He is a registered professional planner credentialed in BC and Alberta with over 18 years of experience providing strategic planning and development advice to public and private sector clients. Colton has had significant experience in municipal planning, including zoning bylaw overhauls and enabling infill and missing middle housing, managing rezoning applications, and has led complex land use zoning bylaw updates in BC and Alberta. When he's not planning how to make cities better, Colton is cycling, hiking, and tending to balcony tomatoes and hot peppers.
Welcome to the session. My name is Colton Kersop, and there was a nice long intro about me already given. I'll just be brief and say I'm a senior planner, lead of business development at McElhaney for community planning, and I'm here to give a brief presentation about our experience in Edmonton. And I'm super curious to what challenges you are facing, and hope we can have a bit of a discussion around what we might be able to do about that. So I'll just jump right in. And so I just want to share a little anecdote about what got it all started in Edmonton in terms of why we decided we might need to move towards a different status quo. And so this sandwich shop, Swiss To Go Sandwiches, is on 118th Avenue in the Beverly neighborhood of Edmonton. It's one of the historic towns that made up the city before it was a city. The city of Edmonton kind of grew up around it and kind of like absorbed Beverly. It was an old coal mining town, and 118th Avenue was the highway through town before they built the Yellowhead. This sandwich shop, when they went to open, they were a pre-existing business moving from one end of the city to the other. They were asked to provide 31 parking stalls. This was not the first time a ridiculous number of parking stalls was required for a permit in Edmonton, but it was the one that got my attention. The applicant was going to, as I said, was not going to be able to open the shop if she had to provide 31 stalls, because there's not even 31 stalls in their parking lot. She approached the Business Improvement Association, who in turn approached me. They appealed to my sense of reason. They'd worked on me on some other initiatives like a facade improvement program, and thought, this guy kind of makes sense. So let's try figuring out if there's a way forward. And basically, I thought it had merit. The reason there were 31 stalls required was the old regulations were based on the total square footage of the establishment. It's actually a really big space on the inside. It's quite a deep store front, but it wasn't really an accurate predictor of demand to regulate parking on the basis of floor area or the length of customer stay, because it's a to-go shop. People often order ahead and go in and pick it up. These are the sandwiches. They're so delicious. And, most of the customers, as I mentioned, order them to go, just like the name of the shop says. But the development officer found that there was too much dining room space to classify it as a takeaway establishment under the regulations of the zoning bylaw. And so there are at least a few problems with the old zoning bylaw. It determines spaces, as I mentioned, on the basis of floor area, not on the basis of demand. It didn't recognize how this business actually functioned, and it penalized main streets and small businesses by treating them like a business in a greenfield area where lands are more plentiful, undeveloped, and cheaper. And so, what is the impact of parking minimums? At least in the context of Edmonton, it was that you're going to have gaps on your main street. So this photo shows how, in the context of old historic buildings and an absence of surface parking, there was actually very frequently someone would buy up a building, knock it down, and bam, now we can meet our parking regulations. The businesses on either side would take advantage of this parking lot. And so that really is a pattern that you can see on the main streets of Edmonton to this day. And some of it is finally, the tide is turning, but you would see this on parts of White Avenue, parts of Jasper Avenue. This is 104 Street, one of the nicest historic streets in the downtown, and many other of the city's main streets. So it was a very visible pattern. So what did all of this lead to? Planners love pilot programs. So it led to a pilot program where the issue kept coming up on traditional main streets. So city council asked administration to study the issue, propose solutions, and monitor the situation and report back. Our solution was to reduce the off-street parking requirements for a number of hospitality-oriented uses and make some other amendments, like exempting more of the floor area from the calculation. So we exempted areas like hallways, back of house, food prep areas, floor area that really could be strongly argued that it didn't contribute to the parking demand. And so, the question is often, well, what did it lead to? Because we had to go back and report back in a year to council. And the best thing was there was no major negative effects to report back on. We were able to issue more development permits in mature areas. We had a lot less appeals to the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board. But the positives for the economy and for urban vibrancy was more small independent food and beverage establishments were able to open, because these are the types of businesses that don't have access to huge cash. They're not part of a big chain. And so I think this is the kind of parking reform that could work really well in smaller communities, and in communities where you want to increase the amount of local businesses, kind of smaller and more organic kinds of businesses. And so we definitely started to see an increase in Main Street vitality. And here's an example of one. So Auto Food and Drink is an independent restaurant on 95th Street. It's a very simple operation. They serve sausages predominantly as their main, and a whole bunch of different side dishes. But, it's a very sort of low overhead operation, built right up to the sidewalk. They have a little bit of parking in the back alley that they share with the apartment building up above. But this is the kind of business that's able to open once you are able to reduce your parking restrictions. It's a company that to this day has become a real solid institution in the community and added a lot of vibrancy where there previously wasn't any. So yeah, that's what happened. And these things have a way of snowballing. And so there was lots more conversation and analysis. The image on screen is from Ashley Salvador, the then leader of the non-government organization Yeg Garden Suites. She is now an elected city councillor in Edmonton. And she used this image at city council and public hearing to drive home the point that pretty much all of Edmonton is significantly overparked. The red areas on screen are surfaces where cars can be parked. So it really came down to the allocation of space, she explained. You don't have infinite space in your backyard. You either get to dedicate it to a place to live or a place to park your car. And so her advocacy message was really around liberating more of a person's yard for more living space. And so that conversation continued to exist. And that organization, Yeg Garden Suites, then advocated for some reductions for garden suites. So in the photo on the upper left, you can kind of see how a garden suite above a garage allows for the preservation of the 2-car parking requirement for the principal dwelling. But what about parking for the garden suite? So under our regulations at the time, in the upper right, there was another surface stall for the car that would supposedly be associated with the garden suite. So this really resulted in a band of parking all across the rear end of the lot. Ultimately, Garden Suites began to advocate for either not requiring parking for the garden suite or reducing the parking for the principal dwelling. Some of their key messages were around the fact that garden suite tenants, about half of them, are not looking for a parking spot, and the buildings were required to have one. So they wanted to point to that disconnect. And the requirement to provide parking for the principal dwelling also made it difficult to build ground-oriented garden suites, or at least have a portion of the development as a ground-oriented garden suite. So we proposed a reduction in the parking required for these suites, and council went for it largely due to the fact that there would probably be limited impact since there were only about 60 garden suites a year in terms of permits issued. So I think they were willing to test one more thing before they went into a bigger conversation, which is ultimately what happened. They decided to reduce the parking requirements for suites and semis and allow the option to unbundle parking for the suite. What did it lead to? It led to council directing administration to actually go into that citywide conversation. And so we started the citywide conversation with pop-up engagement at shopping malls, libraries, and rec centers. And our engagement was conversational and intended to drive people to the project website and surveys. We developed some branding and some key messages, and the point was to get people actually thinking about the issue and the trade-offs, and to move them into that thinking mode rather than that reacting mode. And our process unfolded over a couple of years of engagement and studies. In Edmonton, we found it important to build high quality visuals to associate with various planning initiatives. It makes the issue more noticeable and approachable. And, you know, what can you do is kind of a rhetorical question, but this is actually what we did. Initially, we didn't have a big budget for this project. We learned a lot from the process, and we noticed that there was more that we could try out on our own using these sort of independent hacking approaches. We initially crowdsourced our data with do-it-ourself surveys. We encouraged planning students to help us survey individual buildings and find out how much of the parking was being used, how much is vacant. At different times of days, we approached apartment buildings and asked if we could get into their underground parkades to see what the current usage of their parkades was, because we didn't have that, you know, $100,000 budget to hire a big consultant to do a huge study to, you know, tell us the things that we thought we needed to know. So a lot of it was DIY at first. We also did a deep analysis of all of our variances and our exemptions, and we found that we were regularly issuing variances and exemptions, but at a price. We were always requiring that parking study. We also decided to look at who else was doing this. Initially, the list was a lot shorter back in the day when we started this work, but there were many cities in America that had actually started this, like Buffalo, New York was one of the bigger ones, but there were lots of smaller ones as well. And then we had our pilots to refer back to as well. So this incremental change allowed us to look at, well, what was happening with those restaurants, what were happening with garden suites and semis, and we were able to report on that. So we ultimately got to a place where we wanted to recommend open option parking, but council wasn't ready to do that yet. So they finally gave us the money to hire Nelson Nygaard to do the big citywide study. And the feedback that they came up with was that Edmonton was basically overparked by 50% in almost every category. So that gave council the confidence after that study was completed, a year after our initial recommendation to go to open option, to actually take that step and make that bylaw amendment happen. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm really happy to hear from you about your communities and what challenges you might be facing with reforms, and we can, you know, spitball some solutions.